Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I can see conversations happening in little pockets, and this just tells you the quality of info that we've had this symposium. And at the very beginning, I asked Carsten von Namen, the head of DW Academy, is this just another talking shop? Well, Prue Clarke, who is actually an expert in media development, is going to tell us how these voices of various stakeholders, myself and yourselves included, and the real needs of users in the global south could be integrated into strategy building. So what next for media development? Welcome, Prue Clarke.
Thank you so much, Edith. And I want to start, I never do this, but I am going to say a very quick thank you to Deutsche Welle Academy and KAS. You have brought together, as you always do, so many of the most interesting people and facilitated collaborations that I've seen play out many times over the years that I've been interacting with you. And I want to say the most important thing that I feel that they do is listen, which is not something that all donors do, which we'll talk about in a minute. So look, I'm, as you can tell, from a southern country, but not the global south. But we will be joined by many representatives from the global south. I'm also a journalist, but I hear a lot of you saying that you're not journalists almost a bit sheepishly, which is kind of, as a journalist, a good thing to hear, because often we're being denigrated these days. But I also want to say, it's fine not to be a journalist. I think what we have learned over the last 2 days is that, it's an ecosystem, and we need all of you, and it's, as these big changes are shaking our industry, it's becoming more and more important that we work with all different players to make sure that our content is reaching the people that it needs to, with whom it can have impact. So before I introduce the rest of the panelists, Deutsche Welle asked me to just say a few words about what I have been doing primarily in West Africa over the last 15 years. So I had formed in 2010 with a journalist called Rodney Sear from Front Page Africa in Liberia, who's been mentioned already. We were very frustrated with what was being done in media development in the donor world in Liberia. It wasn't being helpful to Rodney in any way. In fact, it was being destructive. So we formed New Narratives. Just let me set the scene a little bit about what exactly was happening in Liberia. So this is a small country, about 5 million people, devastated by a civil war. And there were two major media development interventions in the country in 2010. One of them I shouldn't name from where the money came, but it's Liberia, and if you know the history, you probably know with whom they are most closely connected, and their president may be facing impeachment. And also, so they were spending $1 million a year, and it later became $2 million a year on media development. And just to put that in context, the biggest media house in Liberia at the time was spending about $50,000 a year. So can you imagine if a foreign power came into your country and started spending on media development more than the entire combined annual expenditure of all your media houses? It was that massive an intervention, but it was just one. The other one was the UN. So the UN had a mission that was, by the end, by 2010, spending $1.4 million a year on a massive radio station. Now, what happened, this should have been enough money to really change the game for media in Liberia, right? But what happened was the UN radio station had such high production values that it was actually sucking out most of the audience share from the local competitors. It was also taking all the best staff out of the local media houses, and they weren't going back, and they were paying them way more. In fact, I lost journalists to be drivers for the UN because the UN was paying so much more than local media. And then on top of that, they were so afraid of upsetting the government that the content was really sanitized. So they wouldn't cover For instance, discussions about access to justice for the war and things like that. So that was that. The USAID, half the money never left Washington, DC, of course. They didn't ever ask or listen to any of the media houses on the ground about what they needed. And they flooded the market with resources. So they didn't actually say which of these media houses are serious about developing an independent business model and what do they need to survive. So they gave their competitors, who were often just cronies of business leaders or politicians, they gave them resources, and they undercut the advantage that the local media houses would have had, the independent media houses would have had if they hadn't been there. So and then the icing on the cake for me was none of this money was spent on digitisation or technology. So there was no help given to these media houses to actually take the next step, and none of it was spent on business development. So the end result is, after tens of millions of dollars that have been spent in Liberia, the Liberian media is on its knees right now. So that's just, and I know this is very true in many, many African countries, because African journalists tell me these things all the time, and they say it to each other, but they often won't say it to the donor world because they're so dependent on getting the donor money. So what we did was we decided to try and take donor money to make smart investments. We've actually raised about $3 million to support journalism in Liberia and Sierra Leone over the last 9 years. We targeted the independents who were serious about developing an independent business model. We gave them support to do good investigative reporting and independent reporting. We put editors in there who had long experience in independent media over a long period. I don't know about you, but I didn't learn journalism in workshops. I learnt from long periods of reporting on the job. And we worked with women. Half of our reporters were women, and it often took a long time to get them to have the confidence. But once they did, they saw that there were stories that weren't being covered by, I always say, testosterone journalism. We heard conversations about this the other day, so politics and scandal. So they recognised that when 1 in 10 births ends in the death of the mother, that this is not a women's issue story, this is a national catastrophe, and it was put on the front page of the newspaper. And this is a good business case as well, right? Because the audience is half women, so when we had more women reporters, the media houses were doing better. So overall, we became one of the revenue streams of our media houses. Exactly as Tanya was talking about, they all have multiple revenue streams, and this donor money is one of them. So if we went away, they would still continue. And the end result has been that the papers that we've worked with have become standard-setting media houses in the country. They break stories that everybody else has to follow up on. They've won awards from all over the world. They've been instrumental in helping ban female genital cutting in the country. They've exposed trafficking rings, endless cases of corruption, and there's a higher standard of journalism in the country as a result. And we spent far less money than USAID and UN spent over that time. So I'm just making the case that I would like to see smarter investments by donors. Forget about workshops. Try to help these media houses understand how they can make money, they can experiment with these new revenue streams, they can get involved in innovation and technology, and they can monetize their diaspora, which Front Page Africa has been very successful at doing. So that's my little spiel. And the hope for me is that there are more and more donors who are starting to understand that and see it. I've been very excited to hear about this idea of a global fund for media development along the lines of the Global AIDS Malaria Fund. Also other ideas. I know, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to speak about BBC and Media Development Fund and other Europeans getting together to try and tackle this business model issue, but that is the key. The prime problem is the business model. If journalists don't have money to do independent reporting, they can't do independent reporting. So, let me welcome, first up, Nesreen Jalala, who is Jalalia. Sorry, my Australian accent lets me down every time. She's a long-time human rights advocate, now the head of Buswala. But sorry, you can correct it when you get a chance. Based in Tunisia, but also long experience with women and children's rights in MENA. So thank you. Welcome to the stage. Tiny Mungwe is a South African filmmaker who heads STEP's documentary film project. Oh, I'm sorry, but you are involved, heavily involved, and the project's called Generation Africa. Pedro Vaca is a lawyer. We won't hold that against him. We need them. And he's been using those skills to defend human rights and press freedom in Colombia, where he is the executive director of the FLIP Foundation for Press Freedom. And finally, in my new role based in Australia, my new BFF is Rishad Patel, who is a long-time product designer and media innovator around Asia and co-founder of Splice Media based in Singapore. So thank you. So I really want to, we all come from different perspectives, and you've heard my little spiel. So what I really am interested in and what you each think is most important in media development in the near future. So why don't we start with you, Tiny?
I chose the wrong seat. I wanted to first, I think I'll echo what you opened with, share a quote by Paulo Freire. It says, "True generosity consists precisely in fighting to destroy the causes which nourish false charity. False charity constrains the fearful and subdued, the rejects of life, to extend their trembling hands. True generosity lies in striving so that these hands, whether of individuals or entire peoples, need to be extended less and less in supplication, so that more and more they become human hands, which work and, working, transform the world." So I'm a producer at STEPS, which is a non-profit media production company in Cape Town. STEPS stands for Social Transformation and Empowerment Projects. This is our third documentary production project called Generation Africa. We started this project 3 years ago and have gone public with it for over 13, 14 months now. We put out a call throughout the continent requesting stories that showed narratives of what the aspirations of the youth on the continent are. We have the youngest youth demographic in the world, and will probably be the biggest economic continent within the next 50 years. And we were interested in finding out what are the aspirations of young people. We wanted to find stories of action and change. But also we wanted to approach this narrative through the topic of migration in order to provide a new narrative about migration by making stories that are told by African filmmakers. So through a process that started with 45 stories, we've developed these stories, supported them both financially but also with professional support, and now we're with 30 documentary films from 17 countries across the continent. Africa is divided along post, or you can say neo-colonial boundaries, Francophone, Anglophone, Lusophone, East Africa, Southern Africa. And this presents different realities around production, opportunities, audiences. And we are interested through this project to experiment in what is possible for African film to recognize its continent as possible South-South collaboration partners, but also to recognize our neighbors who speak different languages and have different historical realities as a result of colonization to also access each other's audiences. Outside of this work of Generation Africa, there's an initiative that I'm a co-founder of called Engage, also focused in the cinema space, where we are going further to resolve these problems by having think tanks that we work in partnership with film festivals regionally with. So we've had a think tank in Durban at the Durban International Film Festival, which I also curate the industry program for. Last week we were in Carthage in Tunisia, where we also had a think tank which was aiming at addressing the divide of North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, but also creating the possibility of Pan-African and Pan-Arabic collaboration. And next week, we're taking this initiative to Afrif, a film festival in Lagos, where we are going to look at the possibility for the Nollywood industry to be a regional leader and to look within the region for possibility for South-South collaboration and capacity building on a South-South basis. In cinema, most of our films, especially documentary films, are funded with a combination of grants, which at the present moment usually comes from the West or the North, as well as co-production, which is also with the North. We want to explore the possibility for co-productions to exist within Africa, as well as the rest of the global South. The landscape, as I've described it so far, is kind of divided into regional hubs, where in North Africa, there's Tunisia, Egypt, Morocco. In South Africa, it's mostly Southern Africa. In East Africa, a really growing regional hub is Nairobi, Kenya. And in West Africa, it would be maybe Senegal for Francophone Africa and Nigeria for Anglophone Africa. And most of the needs in order to consolidate this region is this continent, and kind of realize what I've described already is to look towards building a strong policy framework for culture, for trade and investment, as well as exchange. And our approach, when I say our approach, I mean the small community that I kind of represent of cinema, is to work towards creating these dialogues, creating these exchanges, both within the global South, but as well between the North and the South, with a perspective of a decolonial perspective. And this is the kind of objective of Engage. Please remind me your question.
Well, can I'll get to it, but you know what, I think people who aren't aware of Sub-Saharan Africa may not realise just how powerful the film industry is. We know about Nollywood, but every country is producing its own films now, and they're amazing. So can you talk a little bit about that and how important that is going forward?
Sure. I mean, the premise is one of unbelievable cultural hegemony coming from that country whose president is up for impeachment. So the content coming from there is cheaper for broadcasters, and over these decades of the introduction of television, say from the 70s, there's been an uptake of watching television and cinema, not so much cinema in some countries, but definitely television. But what's been missing is stories that represent us. Stories that also represent our neighbors and give us a perspective to walk through the project of decolonization. So in many industries, these industries have kind of mushroomed up with serious challenges in terms of technical production values. And these have been slowly improving, especially with the advancements of technology. There's a huge appetite for homegrown stories. There's a huge appetite for new stories. There's an unbelievable market for telenovelas from South America, but also huge opportunities, both in terms of production, but also distribution, broadcast, and the dissemination of content. So this is something that can be leveraged, I think, by the industry to grow South-South collaborations, but also not forgetting that the decolonial project is not just a project of those from the global South, it's also a project of those in the North, in order for both to liberate each other from this dialectic of formerly colonized and former colonizer. We need to work together, but we also need to recognize the real linkages in terms of resources, from the extraction of resources into the West that has started during colonization and continues now, but also that we live in the same kind of economic, cultural, and political ecosystem.
What is our television channels in Africa willing to run African-produced documentaries?
The appetite for documentary in Africa is still an area that needs serious work. STEPS has a distribution platform called AfriDocs. So we curate about 45 documentaries at any given time, which are available free at any time in a geo-blocked basis. We fundraise for licenses to acquire this content, and we put it on our platform, but we also work with broadcasters to give them this content to create versions for each of the regions. And I think it's also important to note that documentary, just like journalism, is a very dangerous kind of medium, and that in states where the business of truth-telling is not popular, it's a very hard sell to make. But again, how we, for the last 3 projects that we've produced, we make content, and then we develop what you call a facilitator's guide. So a kind of corresponding thing here would be what you are terming in this conference media information literacy. And we provide these films to a network of mobile cinema, which is mostly concentrated in Southern Africa and East Africa, along with these facilitators' guide, as a way to assist communities to watch films and have meaningful debates and discussions that allow them to reflect on their experiences, but also to reflect on the opportunities to change their societies. We also work in participatory filmmaking, where we deal with various topics from health, HIV and AIDS, to identity, sexuality, and kind of addressing various social problems and political problems. But participatory filmmaking is very important because it breaks the kind of dichotomy between the filmmaker and the subject, and it allows communities to participate in the stories that they tell. And I think this is also important towards the project of building an appetite for documentary on the continent, understanding how they can be part of the storytelling process and writing their own narratives.
And of course, one thing that will be different to a lot of people outside of Africa is that you actually have to pay the channels to host your program, which can be prohibitive as well. So it's very different.
But definitely lucrative for the channels.
Yes. Okay, Nazreen, what are your thoughts?
You did not make it very easy for me. Okay. Much less glamorous than filmmaking. Okay, my main takeaway first from this, and yesterday I was saying, I'm not a journalist, as if like today I'm thinking I'm not a journalist, and that's absolutely fine. It's fine. It's totally fine. One of the things that I have been discussing with my colleague from Tunisia is the issue of sustainability tied to media development. And we were discussing yesterday whose sustainability and what sustainability are we looking for? Is it the sustainability of our own existence, or the sustainability of what we are delivering and what we are able to achieve with what we deliver? And from that, the entire thought of the discussion went on, of course, the donor landscape, but also the ecosystem. And when I think of the ecosystem, it's like today, for example, I discovered that with my NGO, we were doing data journalism. That's what I casually discovered in one of the sessions. And it's extremely crucial to pause, I believe, at this point, and for every one of us to reflect, but also to rethink the ecosystem we are in order to have as much as a comprehensive action together. One of the things I have been, that struck me this morning is Thiti, I think from Thailand, was thinking of setting up his, the watchdog of their parliament while we have the code. And I was thinking, coming from a human rights perspective, in the social justice world, we would call that solidarity. So I would just give out the code and the script for how they can do that. And in the tech world and the media world, that's called open source and open data things. So
there isn't enough collaboration.
There isn't
in
enough
world,
collaboration,
no.
and I believe strong mapping of not only, and I've been hearing a lot of networks of journalists and media, etc., but I've never heard of these platforms, and I'm sure that we can change that landscape and be much more inclusive of the topics that, because all of us are somehow engaged into human rights defense. So the substance and the themes that we are tackling through but also the ways we are doing it and where we're getting that money from. The other thing is that drives me to the access to information that has become today so easy because the information is everywhere and we actually detox sometimes from the information and go away and get off the grid, etc. But it has become so difficult to access quality information and the information that we need and the information that we want. And this, I'm not sure how politically correct that is. We are in an era of growing populisms, and we absolutely cannot do our job by being oblivious to what is happening in many countries. And those who are holding the funds that keep us sustainable, but also in an era of a growing, more or less violent response to these populisms. And I'm thinking of what you said this morning or yesterday, and I cannot remember anymore. We need to know our audience more and more, and we are targeting, and I know, for having done campaigns on Facebook to target our audience, because we just want these indicators of outreaching to these women over 45 with what's happening in the parliament, because that's an indicator. With the donor, the women living in a certain area who are rural, and how we can target them, and how we can, target them is a military term, or how we can outreach to them. But are we sure of, if that information was relevant anyway to that woman, they would get it? Or if that information was important to that person, maybe she or he would look for it and access it. And it brings back this ethical marketing that we do. Do we want people to access good information at all costs, or is there a line that we should not cross? Maybe the answer is in knowing the medium that we are using and diversifying that medium. Maybe the answer is also going out from our offices a little bit more and from behind our desks a little bit more. So it's, I think Sophie yesterday said it's important, these kind of conferences, to leave with questions. And I'm leaving with questions, but also dilemmas of how bad do I want everyone to access the information I want them to see and to know. Yeah, so I
think two of the themes very clearly of this conference have been community, but also finding ways to produce much more engaging content to reach our audiences, right? Pedro.
Thank you. I think that, what is next for media development? I think that, just knowing that for 2 days we've been talking with people that is trying to face the frustration of the moment in the media, I think that it's very important. I really appreciate the diverse public, the people that came, the projects from the South, and I think that in some international conferences we used to have like the mainstream actors, like the big media outlets and their dilemmas and challenges, and also people that is seeking for new ways to communicate and to do journalism, and that relationship is not balanced at all. So in this case, I think we are framing that people, or mainly that people, that is looking for alternatives in parallel to the big media outlet challenge, which I think that it's amazing because it makes all of our conversation more honest and more clear. What else? I think, and I agree completely with you, the floor of the media development agenda, let's say, is the atmosphere of freedom. And probably it sounds like something close to politics, to legal frames, to a lawyer that is very proud. I'm a lawyer, but I'm proud for working for journalists in my country. So, and I do this because of what they deliver, not because I'm an individual privilege. There's no, freedom is at risk, and we have to notice that. And the way the Press Freedom Organization used to frame the situation is like, North Korea, you're the bad guy, which is true, and any of the northern countries, you are good. That is not enough for explaining what is happening with freedom nowadays, because we have southern countries that are improving in some elements that are not well recognized in some cases. We have northern countries that used to be so free, but probably are not that much at this moment. So I think that, but the floor of media development is freedom, and we have to keep fighting for freedom, and I think we have to highlight in this conversation.
Maria Ressa says, hold the line.
Hold the line.
Hold the line.
What else? In the media community, which is where I work for, we used to, when we think about money or about finances, we used to look for the enemy. So the enemy, in my country, the most important enemies for the, very traditional media outlets are the social media platforms. They say Facebook and Google and Twitter, they're getting our content without paying, and they are taking profit of that and revenues, which is also a more complex debate, but they just frame it as an enemy. And the second one is, and it's a paradox, is the audience. That audience is not able to pay. They do not want to pay, they want everything for free, and that's another complex topic that they are not facing, they are just labeling as that's our enemy. And I think that these new projects of journalism that are in parallel to the traditional media outlets has something that is really, unique, and I think it's worldwide, or it's one of the impressions that I'm having from this conference, and is the self-critic, the self-evaluation. As we are small, most of us, as we are like working in a struggling environment, we have to, and we have to do evaluations for our donors too. So we do evaluate more and better than traditional media outlets. So I think that is something that is there. For example, media information literacy, I think that's something we have to improve in the next conferences. I would like to hear like ministers of defense of governments with that follow democratic values, sharing how the structure of education is including technological skills for young people. That should be, from the pilot to the structure, I think that media information literacy should be there. And just to wrap up this intervention, I think we have to shift from the change and the piloting to the link. I mean, how do we link what we are doing in a very practical way? So I've heard a lot of experiences, but I have a lot of doubts about how much did it cost, which could be the way for implementing that, which is the key actors you hired for implementing that. So, I mean, blockchain, as was said this morning, was exposed as like the future of journalism and the future of sustainability. I mean, let's have this conversation on the ground and let's see how could we engage or at least keep a word of that conversation. So I think we should move the peer-to-peer experiences, the changing, I mean, which is also interesting to how do we link and how do we cooperate in a very practical way. Because also it could be useful for a donor investment, a smart donor investment. So if you applied, I don't know, virtual reality project there that was so successful and you have a similar situation there, then there are some skills here that could be implemented and with a smart budgeting. And this is my final idea. From my experience in Colombia, I've seen a lot of young journalism with like entrepreneurships or startups, let's say media startups. And they know how to do journalism, but they do not know how to manage journalism. So, for example, budgeting, it's something far away, I mean, very far.
We shouldn't have to think about that.
No? So they say, okay, I need a story, so I need a salary of 3 journalists, and I need a camera, and I need to buy the software, and okay, you have indirect cost. You have to think about security. You have to think about the office. And you have to think about taxes. You have to, I mean, and other things that are related to the business. So I also would like to see in future symposiums like this, like I would say training for management. I mean, not for journalism, because it. Also, I think that is a struggle for donors. No? When you meet a person that has a great idea, okay, I will support you, and then you say, okay, so how do you manage your money? Okay, I do not have a bank account. Okay, you have to open it, and you need an account that is overviewing what you're doing, and you to put the checks and bills of what you were spending. So that's something that I think it's really a struggle.
No, I've often said that this is no longer a journalism training problem. This is a business problem. Yeah. So, Rishad, so you're 2 years into a project really working with startups in an extremely difficult region where a lot of authoritarian regimes, you know, startup digital media houses in America have sort of been on the downturn in the last few years. What makes you optimistic about the media houses you're working with?
Actually, to borrow from what Pedro was talking about right now, is it's interesting that we're seeing the craft of journalism and the marriage of that craft with the business of journalism. Mm-hmm. And I think that those skills are developing slowly but surely in the regions that we work. Again, to take a leaf out of Tiny's book, I mean, you said it really well, where, you know, we, like you, work in countries where the business of truth-telling is not hugely popular. We're in regions like Myanmar and Cambodia, and we're going to start some work in Nepal. And I mean, Myanmar is a scary situation. We've been working there now for the past 2 years on one project after another with tiny media startups. And sometimes, again, to your point, Pedro, it's Alan and I, my co-founder and I, we often find ourselves talking to, say, a startup like Myanmar Now, who do these ridiculously courageous stories about people in the provinces and what they're going through, the indignities, is to put it mildly. And we tell them, at Splice, we're in the business of wanting you to continue to tell truth to power, continue to hold people in power responsible, but we'd like for you to do it tomorrow, and then we'd like for you to do it next week, and then we want you to do it next year. In fact, we are in your service, and we would like to make this regular. We'd like for you to pay rent. We'd like for you to pay your people, and we'd like for you to pay your lawyers. And it's heartrending, because when you're in a situation where your newsroom comes to a grinding halt because the government throws so much paperwork at you that keep you in court for weeks and weeks and weeks. I mean, this guy, he, the founder of Myanmar Now, is just recently, maybe 3 months ago, finally free of his battle in court over 2 years. And he can finally go back to writing stories. And that's not going to work in the future. What is going to work is to be able to actually create a system where, hey, if you're not there, let us look after the boring work of editorial workflows, of your tech that you need, of your business structure, of how you look at legal procedures and have systems in place. These are really boring things, and frankly, painful things, a lot of which I don't understand. But we try and put those systems in place so that journalism can continue, that the stories can continue, that this actual work can continue. I mean, again, you're talking about platforms. Myanmar, again, a beautiful place with beautiful stories and beautiful people and truly scary online world. Myanmar is a Facebook-first country. I mean, how troubling is that? There is no browser use, there is no search engine use, there is no email use, and there is no app use. So when you want to do all of these things, you go to Facebook. It's said that the only time somebody in Myanmar uses email is when they go to the shop, they buy a cell phone, and they tell the guy to set up their Facebook account. You need an email to set your Facebook account up, and that's the only time they use it. When they forget their password, they go back to the shop and say, hey man, what's that whole, I can't get into my Facebook account. That's how scary that is. When they want to search, they search Facebook. When they want to talk to people, they speak on Facebook. So how do you create publishing systems? And we're talking about not just, us people. We're talking about entire publishing systems and communities are all on Facebook. And I might sound biased, but I don't think that's healthy. I don't know, So how do you convince people that, hey, your audiences are out there, they're sitting right next to you, and maybe email is a platform that you own. You own that data. Why don't you move to email? It's horribly low tech, but we found that increasingly when you want to talk to people and you want them to talk back, hey, good old email newsletter. That's a publishing system unto itself. We have a lot of success with these things, and in fact, successful media companies can be built on these fairly low-tech systems.
And are. I mean, in America, there are many people who are surviving simply on email newsletters.
Absolutely.
It's extraordinary, yeah.
I mean, you guys know me, but I'm the guy who goes on talking about audiences and blah, blah, blah. And those audiences are, in fact, coming to products like unheard of media products for journalism, trust me. Products like, Quartz is doing now, as part of their membership program, presentations. You can subscribe to presentations. The Information in San Francisco, which does tech finance news, so there's a very specific sliver of people who want tech news, but not here's how the latest Google phone works, but here's the money and finance angle to this. What's happening in the boardrooms of Facebook and Apple and all of that. In the finance world, they're doing things like chat rooms and Slack channels. One of their products is commenting on the website. people buy access to be able to comment on the website. One of the most validating things that we did for Frontier Myanmar, a very brave organization that we have the privilege of working with in Yangon. If you guys don't know them, please look them up. They're our heroes. Sunny Shui, the founder of Frontier Myanmar, used to run a thing called Myanmar Times, and he published, they used to publish beautiful articles, hugely researched articles on next to no money at all, and investigative journalism. And he then got into real trouble, ran afoul of the government, and they locked him up for 8 years. He went to prison for 8 years. They put him in solitary confinement. They come to him after 8 years and said, hey, if you sign this document saying that you absolve us of all guilt and that you are in fact guilty, we'll let you out now. Otherwise, you're going into solitary for another 6 months. Sonny, who I consider one of my dearest friends now, he said, go ahead. I like solitary. You know who I made friends with over there? A cockroach. It's much nicer than you guys. Go ahead. I'm not signing anything. Send me back to solitary. I demand it. And they sent him back. And he did another 6 months. And they dangled this in front of him. And he says, yeah, no problem. He came out, and 4 months later, he started Frontier Myanmar. And they get away with mentioning words like Rohingya and Rakhine and genocide. And we are so happy to be involved with, setting up a membership project for them. And the first thing we did, Alan and I at Splice, when we went into their office, was invite bunches of their readers to the newsroom. And this was the first time they'd done it. We called them focus groups. So we put them in the newsroom, and we said, you're going to get some tea and really shitty biscuits, and let's all hang out here, and let's talk about this membership program. So you said, why do you want to talk to us about this? Oh, we wanted to ask you what kind of members you want to be. Do you want a membership program? Would you be a member of Frontier? What do you want in exchange? So we had 4 or 5 days of about 3 groups a day. And it was amazing. Most of them, we threw ideas at them, we threw presentations at them, we said, here's our plan and here's the membership benefits. And they said, don't you get it? We're not really in this for benefits. We want to be members because we want to support the journalism that these guys are doing. So what do you mean support? No, we want to pay for it. So wait, what do you want in return? I don't know. Because all the journalism is on the website for free, and it's a ludicrously priced print magazine that I think people should pay much more for, but that's my job. And they're like, yeah, we're doing this for support. You ask them, and they tell you these surprising things.
Yeah, no, we've found that too in West Africa, that if you produce quality, people really appreciate it, and they will pay for it.
Absolutely.
So, look, we're standing between us, them, and lunch. So I'm going to throw it out to the audience for about 10 minutes of questions. So, who wants to go first? They're really hungry, apparently.
What kind of lunch do you want?
Exactly. Here, there's one. Yay.
Hello, I'm Anna-Dora Smith, a media consultant mainly in Eastern and Southern Africa. I would just like to come back to one thing that was actually raised this morning, but I think it still fits here. We talked about ethical standards. I mean, we all can see that it's very difficult to keep journalism going in this day and ages and get the finances ready and all that sort of thing. But it was mentioned that we always still have to make sure that ethical standards are adhered to. How do you think that can be achieved?
I have a sneaking suspicion that that question is directed to me. Right. And you guys are just looking at me. Come on, guys. Hey. No. I agree. I have a feeling that ethical standards are I have the simplistic view that they're not that difficult to adhere to. We seem to, and please, I'm probably wrong, but hey, we seem to somehow, when we equate money or being paid for the journalism that, all these, I'm not a journalist, but being paid for the journalism that you do, that somehow that dirties it or sullies it. And I don't think that that's true. I think that it's eminently easy to be paid a fair wage for the stories that you do and for the truth that you hold to power. Are there ethical standards that we must adhere to? Yes, there are. I mean, like the rest of business and law and filmmaking and funding. Can
I just add? I took some time to come to this. I'm an old school journalist as well, but I've been watching very closely what media houses have been doing in the West to try and make sure that they're online, they're on media, they're getting their news to the new platforms where people are actually consuming news, and they're still doing it very well. I mean, if you look at social videos coming through social media platforms from the best media houses in the world, New York Times, BBC, Channel 4, they're still great journalism. I think you can still, I've become persuaded that you can still do great journalism on social media and uphold all the ethics that we've come to expect. Yes, of course, go.
Very important.
So you start again, I think your mic was on.
Oh, is that okay? Yeah. So this ethical journalism or ethical publishing as well is very important. The NGO I'm running started with a group of people who forged journalist cards to enter the parliament, to be able to watchdog the parliament. That was not very ethical, we would, unarguably. In our training, the induction training of our parliamentary reporters, one of the things we tell them is that if you find any unattended document, take it. We come from a country, I'm from Tunisia, and in my country, everything that was happening in the parliament throughout the modern history of Tunisia was broadcasted at 11:30 p.m. With a voiceover. So we didn't know, before the revolution, we didn't know the voices of our parliamentarians. We had no idea of what they were doing. Our main purpose was to just go to the parliament the day they were elected, sit there, never leave, report on their every move. Why they're absent, where they go, what they do, who they meet, the lobbying that happened when the state is preparing its budget and they are about to pass it, so all the lobbying happening in the parliament. And we have a tendency in the post-dictatorship regimes with the complicated situation about terrorism, to put a whole lot of things under national security. And we don't like it. And so, ethics, for sure. For us, the ethics is to make sure the information we put out there is true, is verified. The way we get that information, if we are an NGO promoting democracy and we know that the people who are supposed to work for us are trying to hide information for us, including the exchange rate for the dinar as opposed to the USD when they are preparing the finances, like the state budget. And that's something they would hide from us. We take it.
It's on. I just want to also share, I'm not sure if it's directly related to what you were asking, but I think it might be interesting for this community of journalism. One of the kind of focal points of the engaged think tanks that we're doing across the continent in Africa is developing a kind of a theory of praxis, kind of like what you call Dogma 95, but not static in a way. So our approach is to kind of build a conversation in which we're inviting people, even outside of cinema, to contribute. And this theory of practice we're calling the ethic, a mature ethic for collaboration, in which we are exploring what that means for the relationship between filmmakers and producers, so the ones who carry the story and the ones who bring in the resources and manage the resources for making the stories, and investigating the relationship between producers and funders, what the ethics of that collaboration is, investigating the relationship, the ethics in the relationship between artists collaborating with each other, and then most importantly, investigating what a mature ethic for collaboration is between people who are creators, specifically around documentaries, and people who are the subjects and the communities that the stories are being told about, that are being made. And we're really hoping to gather as many voices as possible in investigating what a mature ethic is, in working through the challenges of having to secure resources in order to get work done, in investigating the problematics of representation that exist in telling stories and sharing stories, and how we position people, characters as we call them, and how the storytelling that we do has an impact on the communities that the stories are being made about. And I think in North Africa, the debate around the burqa, for example, really presents a lot of, there are many, many other examples as well, around what the responsibilities of storytelling are and what the imperatives of being able to continue to do this work are. So please follow that conversation as well.
I think that's a really important point, that, ethics are different everywhere and they're evolving everywhere. Down there.
Thank you. My name is Shola. I'm from Nigeria. My question or observation goes to Tiny. Good work. Kudos for the efforts yourself and the colleagues and steps are taking. I'm just thinking, because you mentioned the fact that getting most of these documentaries you shoot aired on terrestrial television is like tricky, the funding issues and all that. And you also mentioned, and like many people here also know, Nigeria has, like it said, is it the third or the second biggest industry for filmmaking? I'm thinking probably you could also reach out to Nigeria. I'm in broadcasting. I'm privileged to be a manager. I can connect you to the MD of my organization. It's the second biggest private media in Nigeria, and we could take it off from there.
There you go.
Thank you. I want to talk. Thank you for this connection. I'd really like to follow up with it after this panel. In our collection, we have 3 documentary films that we're producing from Nigeria. And the form of documentary in Nigeria is not very well advanced, but we have recently done a campaign of a collection of films around migration, which were broadcast in Nigeria, and the audience response was huge because the issue of migration is so critical and urgent in Nigeria. But I also think that there are many other topics that could use a space to discuss that is not generally done in the fiction area, in this Nollywood space. I think the first film I've seen talking about Biafra was Green, White, Green. I've never seen a Nollywood film tackling very critical political issues in Nigeria in a way that's necessary. So I think that there's a real need for documentary in order to drive dialogue, and the community of filmmakers that I know from Nigeria want to have the space to have this discussed. So having the buy-in of broadcasters and such as yourself is really important, so thank you for this.
Okay, I'm just going to give Pedro the last word because you haven't had as much time to talk as everyone else.
I was thinking about the ethics and what's next for media development. I think the media community should not avoid anymore to talk about ethics. But with that said, I think ethics is really important. But it's also, and in countries like Colombia, is misunderstood sometimes, that word, and sometimes it's also used for censorship. No? So I think those are other angles that the word ethics implies. In the next symposium, I would put that topic, because I think we have to frame that conversation, we have to follow that situation, but I would link that with other concepts that I think are related. For example, accountability of powerful people around our environment. Because when you think about our ethics or our behavior and, Facebook or the person that owns Facebook ethics, probably his ethic frame has a huge impact on our environment. So let's put the view on the powerful people. I would like to know which is the ethic in public discussion of some presidents of northern countries. No? Because if they do not follow what we call ethics here, probably we can develop a lot of rules for journalism, but the impacts in democracy are huge. So, and the other concept is democratic values. Powerful people in this environment should follow democratic values. And it is simple, but it's something that probably powerful people is not committed with. So let's keep that point because I think it's important, but also we have to distinguish between the key actors and the powerful actors and the ethics or the accountable or the behavior of that powerful actors, because it's important from journalism, but it's also important for the environment and the powerful people.
Yeah, I think that's another conference, but a good point that the challenges going on in the geopolitical space, and especially the democratic northern leaders' behaviour, is having a ripple effect on everybody, and journalists in the global south are feeling it as well. So thank you so much, and thank you again to Deutsche Welle and KAS for giving us this opportunity to bring so many interesting people. You do a great job of finding the best people around the world. And collaborations, here's one that's just happened, and we really look forward to seeing how they all play out. So thank you again. Thank you to Nesreen, Pedro, Tiny and Rishad.